You live your whole life believing you are a portrait, carefully painted onto a grand canvas. You know the artist, you know the colors, you know the wall upon which you are meant to hang. You understand your purpose, your place. You are the heir, the culmination of a bloodline. That was me. Clara Ainsworth, granddaughter and chosen successor to the formidable Victoria Ainsworth. My life was a straight line, drawn from her legacy to my future. I was the portrait, complete and assured. I never imagined that with the opening of a single suitcase, I would discover I was not the painting at all, but merely the canvas upon which a forgery had been created. The day my grandmother's will was read was, for me, a coronation. I had been groomed for this since birth. While my cousins were taught to sail and play polo, I was taught to read balance sheets and hostile takeover bids. Victoria's love was a crucible, and she had spent my entire life forging me into a perfect copy of herself. So, when Mr. Abernathy read her final testament, there were no surprises, only the bitter, jealous faces of my relatives to my granddaughter, Clara Ainsworth. The will declared in Victoria's unbending voice, "In whom I see the future. Of our name and the iron will to protect it, I leave my entire estate, my controlling interest in Ainsworth Industries, and the legacy that comes with it. May she guard it as fiercely as I did." I accepted my inheritance with the quiet gravity she had taught me. I saw the envy in my family's eyes, but I also saw their resignation. They had known this was coming. I was the chosen one. I was the true heir. The line of succession was clean, absolute, and undisputed. The only other item mentioned felt like a tender postscript, a final personal touch from the cold woman I had so desperately loved. "One final bequest," Mr. Abernathy read, clearing his throat. "To my granddaughter, Clara, I leave my old leather suitcase, which has been my constant companion. I ask that she open it only when she is ready for the truth." It felt sentimental, not ominous. My relatives likely saw it as a final symbol of my victory, the passing of her most personal possession. Later that day, in the quiet grandeur of her massive, empty mansion, a place that was now mine, I felt a wave of triumphant nostalgia. I sought out the suitcase, not for a hidden will, but for a hidden piece of her soul. I wanted to find old journals, faded photographs, mementos that might finally explain the woman behind the matriarch. The suitcase smelled of her, of expensive leather, old paper, and a faint metallic scent I couldn't place. It was heavy, as if weighted with more than just memories. I clicked open the latches, my heart full, expecting to finally understand the woman who made me. I did not yet know that I was about to be unmade. Inside, there were no journals, no photo albums, just a single sealed yellowed manila envelope resting on a bed of dark velvet. It had no name, no title. It felt ancient and forbidden. My hands trembled as I broke the brittle seal and pulled out a single folded document. It was a laboratory report, the paper thin and fragile with age. The letterhead was from a private genetics facility, dated 25 years ago, just weeks after my birth. My blood ran cold. It was a DNA kinship analysis. I saw the names, clinical and stark. Sample A, Victoria Ainsworth, grandmother. Sample B, subject, father. Sample C, Clara Ainsworth, child. My eyes scanned past the technical data, the allele frequencies, the incomprehensible strings of numbers, searching for the conclusion at the bottom of the page. And then I saw it. A single sentence, written in the cold, detached language of science that served as the executioner of my entire existence. Conclusion. The child, Clara Ainsworth, shares no genetic markers with the Ainsworth paternal lineage. The maternal kinship with Victoria Ainsworth is hereby excluded. The probability of kinship is 0%. 0%. The number echoed in the silent room. It was a perfect, Absolute, complete negation. Every memory, every lesson, every loving glance, and every cruel test from the woman who raised me flashed before my eyes, all of it instantly curdling into a monstrous lie. The portrait of my life was set on fire, burning away to reveal the blank, worthless canvas beneath. I was not an Ainsworth. I was not her kin. I was a stranger in my own life, an imposter who had just inherited a stranger's kingdom. I looked down at my hands, the hands I thought were hers, and for the first time in my life, I had no idea who I was. If you've ever had a moment that made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself, hit that like button. Because my world wasn't just shaken, it had ceased to exist. For days, I didn't exist. I floated through the grand, empty rooms of my inherited prison like a ghost, the silence broken only by the echo of that one, perfect, annihilating number, 0%. I'd catch my reflection in a darkened window or a polished tabletop, and I would flinch, startled by the face of a stranger. My eyes, which Victoria had always said were Ainsworth eyes, sharp as flint, now belonged to someone else. My hands, which she'd claimed had the same deftness as her own, were the hands of a genetic interloper. Every compliment she had ever given me now felt like a carefully crafted lie, a detail painted onto the forgery to make it more convincing. The legacy I was meant to carry wasn't mine. I was a walking, breathing counterfeit. This limbo, this state of unbeing, was a torture worse than any cruelty she had shown me in life. The grief for the woman I thought was my grandmother was replaced by a desperate, clawing need to understand why. Why orchestrate such a monstrous, lifelong deception? Why choose me? And the most terrifying question of all, the one that kept me awake at night. If I am not Clara Ainsworth, then who am I? This need for answers, for any anchor in the storm of my non-existence, drove me back to the suitcase. It was no longer a symbol of her memory. It was the scene of my own murder. I knew there had to be more. A plan this meticulous would have contingencies. It would have a full story. I ran my hands over every inch of it, pressing every rivet, tracing every seam, performing an autopsy on the container of my life's lie. My fingers caught on something in the velvet lining of the lid. A subtle thickness, a slight resistance. It was a hidden pocket, stitched so perfectly it was nearly invisible. My heart hammered against my ribs as I carefully worked the stitches loose with my fingernail. Inside, my fingers pulled out a folded, brittle paper. It was a birth certificate. The date of birth was mine. The hospital was mine. The parents' names listed were my parents' names. But the name typed in the box for the child, in crisp dark ink, was not mine. It read, Morgan Ainsworth. Morgan. The name felt like a phantom limb, a piece of me I never knew was missing. This was the real child. The real portrait that had been swapped for a blank canvas. I was the blank canvas. Beneath the certificate was something small and cold. A faded plastic hospital bracelet, the kind they put on newborns. The tiny white, beads yellowed with age. The letters spelled out the name Morgan. Next to it, in a tiny glassine envelope, was a lock of baby-fine blonde hair. My hair was dark, and beside that, one final damning piece of evidence. Another DNA report. This one was different. It showed a 99.9% probability of kinship between Victoria Ainsworth and the genetic material from the sample labeled Morgan. She had kept proof of the truth, and proof of the lie. But why? Why this elaborate, cruel exchange? At the very bottom of the secret pocket, my fingers found one last folded letter. It wasn't from her. It was on the letterhead of a prominent genetic specialist, dated a month before our birth. It was addressed to a younger Victoria. As I read the clinical, detached language, the true, monstrous nature of her plan finally crystallized before me. The doctor wrote of confirming a diagnosis. He wrote of a recessive gene carried in the Ainsworth bloodline, a gene that, when passed down, had a significant chance of manifesting as a rare, degenerative neurological condition. A condition that meant a slow, cruel decline in one's 30s. A taint, as she would have seen it, a flaw in her perfect genetic tapestry. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a whim. This wasn't an act of passion or madness. It was a calculated, eugenic decision. She had discovered her true grandchild, Morgan, would carry this flawed gene. So, she had arranged a swap. She found a healthy baby born on the same day, me, and simply replaced her defective heir with a perfect, unassuming substitute from what she must have deemed a lesser family. I wasn't chosen for my potential. I was chosen for my clean bill of health. I was a patch. I was the healthy weed she planted in her garden after pulling up the rose she believed was diseased. The questions shifted then, from who I was to something far darker. What happened to Morgan? Was the real heir cast aside, given to another family, or left in the hospital system? Are they even still alive? I looked in the mirror again, at the stranger staring back at me, and I understood. My entire life, my health, my fortune, my very name, it was all built upon the sacrifice, the erasure of someone else. And the woman who had orchestrated it all had named me her sole heir. The game was more twisted than I could ever have imagined. For what felt like an eternity, I was paralyzed, trapped between two different kinds of hell. Before me lay two paths, and both led to ruin. The first was the path of truth. I could reveal everything. The DNA tests, the birth certificate for B, Morgan, the doctor's letter. I could expose Victoria's monstrous secret to the world. And what would I gain? Nothing. I would lose the inheritance, the power, the name. I would be cast out by the only family I had ever known, becoming a pariah, a genetic ghost with no history and no future. I would be utterly and completely alone, a nobody. The thought was terrifying. The second path was the path of the lie. I could stay silent. I could burn the evidence, accept the inheritance, and live out my days as the counterfeit Clara Ainsworth. I would have the empire, the wealth, the power. But I would be a fraud forever. Every success would be tainted. Every relationship built on a foundation of deceit. I would have to look my parents in the eye every day, knowing I was not their child. The hollowness of that existence, the crushing weight of that lifelong performance, felt like it would be its own kind of death. To be a queen of a kingdom you have no right to, haunted by the ghost of the person you replaced. That was a prison of a different sort. So I was trapped. Condemned if I told the truth, and condemned if I lived the lie. My grandmother, it seemed, had checkmated me from beyond the grave. In a final, morbid act of farewell, I went back to the suitcase one last time. I touched the cold plastic of Morgan's hospital bracelet. I looked at the faded photograph of the two unknown infants. I was about to close the lid on it all when my fingers brushed against a small, hard object tucked into a tight side pocket I had somehow missed. It was a micro-cassette recorder, a small silver dictation machine from the 80s. It was heavy and cold in my hand. A tiny yellowed label was affixed to it, with one word written in Victoria's script: playback. My blood ran cold. This was it, the final piece. The epilogue to my own destruction. Or perhaps the preface to something new. I walked to the massive desk in her study, the desk that was now supposed to be mine, sat down in her leather chair, and pressed the play button. The hiss of old tape filled the silence. And then, her voice, not frail or old, but sharp, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion, as if she were dictating a business memo, filled the room. "Hello, my dear substitute," the voice on the tape began. "If you are listening to this, it means you have uncovered the full architecture of my design. I will not waste your time with apologies. I do not feel any. The swap was a practical necessity. A gardener must weed their garden to protect the prize roses. It was a simple matter of quality control. Morgan, my true grandchild by blood, carried a flaw. You did not. The transaction was logical. But the swap, you see, was merely setting the stage. The real test, the one that truly matters, is the one you face right now. All those years, I watched you. I wondered, was the Ainsworth spirit, the ruthlessness, the will to power, the instinct for survival, a matter of blood? Or could it be forged in an outsider? I did not raise you to be an Ainsworth by blood. I raised you to see if you could become an Ainsworth by will. A true successor is not born. They are made. And they are made in the moment they choose power, over sentiment, survival over the saccharine poison of truth. The inheritance you hold is not a birthright. It is a trophy. It is the prize for the winner of this final, most important game. The game of your own identity. So, the choice is yours. The final move on the board. Who are you, my dear substitute? Are you the sentimental child of the lesser family I took you from, who will crumble under the weight of a truth that renders you a nobody? Will you cry? Will you rage? Will you relinquish the throne because of a piece of paper? Or are you my creation? The heir I truly forged, who will understand that the truth is just a story, and power is the only story that matters. Will you be the one who is ruthless enough to burn the evidence and seize the kingdom you were raised to occupy? This choice is your true birth. Decide who you are. The tape clicked off, leaving a profound silence in its wake. The last vestiges of love I had for the woman who raised me withered and died in that moment. But what replaced it was not simple hatred. It was a chilling, crystalline understanding. I finally saw the world through her eyes. I understood the rules of her brutal universe. The game was never about blood. It was never about who I was. It was about who I had the strength to become. My despair, my paralysis, it all burned away like a fog in a harsh new sun. Victoria didn't want a grandchild. She wanted a successor. And she had designed one final monstrous test to see if her substitute was worthy. A cold, hard resolve settled into my bones. I would not be the sentimental child. I would not be the victim. I would be her creation. I would be the winner of her game. And I would prove that the healthy weed she planted was far more dangerous and far more worthy of the garden than the flawed rose she had cast aside. My first act as queen of my stolen kingdom was not to issue a decree or to fire a rival. It was a baptism by fire. My own. That night, in the massive marble fireplace of Victoria's, of my study, I built a small, precise pyre. One by one, I fed the ghosts of my past to the flames. The DNA test showing a 0% match was the first to go. I watched the paper curl, the clinical, scientific words blackening and turning to ash. The forgery was unmade. Next, I dropped Morgan's birth certificate into the fire. A life I never knew. A name I had stolen, vanished into smoke. Then came the tiny beaded hospital bracelet. I watched the plastic warp and melt in the heat, the name Morgan contorting before it was consumed entirely. I was destroying the evidence, yes. But more than that, I was destroying the girl who had been paralyzed by it. I was burning away the sentimental child. All that remained was the creation, and the creator's final message on the audio tape. I kept that. For now. Weeks later, my position as CEO was secure on paper, but the family was restless. They saw my inheritance as a fluke, my leadership as a temporary placeholder. They were waiting for me to fail. Leo, in particular, couldn't stand it. He challenged me in my first board meeting. I had proposed a radical, aggressive restructuring, a plan to sell off 3 of the company's oldest, most sentimental, but least profitable divisions. It was a classic Victoria Ainsworth move, ruthless, unsentimental, and smart. "This is reckless," Leo declared, his voice ringing with false concern for all the board members to hear. "Grandmother would have never sold the divisions her own father started. This isn't how an Ainsworth protects the family legacy." The old Clara would have shrunk. She would have stammered, defended her logic, sought their approval. But the old Clara was a pile of ash in my fireplace. I let him finish, holding his gaze with a placid, unnerving calm until he faltered. I leaned forward slightly. "The difference between my grandmother and you, Leo," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the boardroom tension like a razor, "is that she built an empire. You were merely hoping to be its caretaker. I am here to build. The legacy is not in sentimental, failing assets. It is in power, and power requires growth." I paused, then delivered the killing blow. Every person and every division in this company is either a tool for that purpose, or it is an obstacle. I am not sentimental about removing obstacles. Is that clear? I saw him flinch. I saw the fear in his eyes, and in the eyes of everyone else at that table. They weren't seeing the quiet, overlooked granddaughter anymore. They were seeing her. They were seeing Victoria. And they were terrified. The challenge to my authority was the first and the last. With the empire secured, there was one final loose end. One variable left unaccounted for on the chessboard. Morgan. My search for her was not born of guilt or a desire to atone. It was the final lesson Victoria had taught me. Control the narrative. Control every piece. Leave nothing to chance. I used the company's vast resources, its private investigators, its data analysts, and I launched a discreet, untraceable search for the ghost whose life I was living. The final report came 6 months later, a slim, unassuming file laid on my desk. The story it told was the most bitter irony of all. Victoria hadn't abandoned her true grandchild to an orphanage. That would have been messy, unpredictable. Instead, she had used her resources to arrange a private, closed adoption. Morgan had been given to a loving, stable, middle-class couple in a quiet town in Oregon. They never knew where their miracle baby had come from. The file contained recent photos. Morgan, who went by the name of Sarah, was a smiling, happy-looking woman, a schoolteacher with 2 children of her own. The report concluded with a full medical workup. The dreaded Ainsworth taint, the degenerative neurological condition, had never manifested. She was perfectly healthy. She had lived a simple, happy, normal life. The life I would have had, perhaps. The life she was saved from. Victoria, in her monstrous act of eugenics, had inadvertently given her true grandchild the one thing an Ainsworth could never have: peace. The flawed rose had flourished beautifully in a simple garden, far from the poison of this empire. I stood there, in my silent office, looking out at the city skyline, and I felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. It wasn't guilt, I felt. It wasn't regret. It was victory. A profound, absolute, and chilling victory. I knew the whole story. I controlled every truth and every lie. I walked to my desk, picked up the microcassette recorder, and pressed the erase button. I held it down as I listened to the hiss of my creator's voice vanishing into silence forever. I no longer needed her instructions. The training was complete. I am not an Ainsworth by blood. I am not the substitute child, Clara. I am not the ghost of Morgan. I am the survivor of Victoria's game. I am the heir of my own choosing. And this kingdom, built on a lie, is now mine by the only right that truly matters: the will to hold it. My grandmother asked if I had the ruthlessness to survive. I decided to have the ruthlessness to win. Subscribe and I'll show you what a legacy built on a lie truly looks like. If you believe we are defined by our choices, not by our birth, subscribe to this channel, because you are about to see what happens when a ghost decides to become a queen.